40-year-old mystery rattles a small Wyoming community.
There's just a desperation to understand what happened to this woman and her 2 children.
A cold case task force uncovers disturbing new clues within the family.
We found human blood in the back deck of that station wagon.
There could be a serial killer who's stalking people and killing people.
But as authorities expose more deadly secrets, the body count continues to escalate.
We had remains exhumed because we wanted to determine if in fact he had been poisoned.
And the suspected killers behind it all leave everyone stunned.
She said, "You're gonna hear that I killed somebody."
I know you're not telling the whole truth, okay? Yes.
They looked at killing people as a solution to a problem.
These were 2 profoundly evil people who found one another. And together they held these incredibly dark, violent, sadistic secrets.
For someone looking to disappear or get away from it all, you can't do much better than Fremont County, Wyoming.
Fremont County is rural. People there can live the life they want to live without a lot of interference from the rest of the world. So it's a place where you can escape the prying eyes of your neighbors.
In 1976, 37-year-old Alice Prunty moved to Fremont County in search of a fresh start. A mother of 5, Alice had just left her 3rd husband.
Alice was an Illinois girl who grew up in a normal family. She was divorced, then widowed, then divorced. She moves in her trailer to Wyoming.
I was the baby. I was a very spoiled baby. My mother supported me. My mom was an awesome mom. She loved music. Saturdays was house cleaning day, and she'd put Tammy Wynette and Tanya Tucker playing on the record player.
3 failed marriages hadn't dampened Alice's determination to find lasting love. She finally found it in the summer of 1976 when she began dating her next-door neighbor, 32-year-old Gerald Uden.
One day, there was a knock on Gerald's door, and it was Alice. She wanted him to help her connect her trailer to the power. He was immediately smitten. She was, to him, the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in the world.
A maintenance worker at a local steel mine, Gerald was also coming off his 3rd failed marriage.
To Gerald, Alice was the whole package. She was independent, she was resourceful, she could support herself.
He fell head over heels in love with my mom.
Just 5 months after meeting, Gerald and Alice tied the knot, and the couple bought a farm in Pavilion, Wyoming.
Mom milked cows. She had chickens. They had their own pigs. As their child, I never really wanted for anything.
In the summer of 1980, Gerald received some unexpected news when his ex-wife Virginia Uden and her 2 young sons, 11-year-old Richard and 10-year-old Reagan, moved to the same small town.
They were not the biological children of Virginia and Gerald Uden. They were her children from a previous marriage. But Gerald had adopted the boys prior to the divorce.
When Gerald learned the boys were moving with their mother to Lander, Wyoming, he was elated.
Gerald took his father role very seriously, and he was a good in Gerald and Alice's home.
Sadly, the reunion would be short-lived. On September 13, 1980, 2 months after Virginia and her sons moved to Lander, her mother, Claire Martin, enters the Fremont County Sheriff's Office with disturbing news.
She wanted to speak to an officer about a missing persons report, and at that time she started telling us about her daughter.
Virginia was supposed to go meet Gerald, Uden, with the boys so that they could go bird hunting.
But when Claire called Gerald to check in on her daughter and grandsons, he informed her that the trio never showed up to meet him.
Virginia doesn't show up at the time that Claire expected her to, and Claire begins to worry.
Gerald agreed to come help her look for them. And so Gerald and Claire went and drove around looking for Virginia and the boys.
They go around places in Riverton that Virginia might have been. They don't find her.
Now that Virginia and her sons have been missing for nearly 24 hours, Claire is concerned that something bad has happened to her daughter and grandsons.
Claire knew her daughter better than anyone, and she knew her daughter wouldn't have just up and left without saying a word or taking any money with her.
She described the vehicle that they were in, which was actually Claire's vehicle, a Ford station wagon.
An attempt to locate was put out with all other agencies, the police departments and things, to watch for the car that she was driving.
3 weeks pass without a word from Virginia Uden or her sons. Then, on October 4th, authorities receive an ominous tip.
A passerby reports to the sheriff's office that he saw a half-hidden station wagon on the edge of a very deep canyon in the Wind River Mountains.
The station wagon's tags identify it as belonging to Claire Martin, the same vehicle Virginia had been driving when she and her sons disappeared.
We found that there was human blood in the back deck of that station wagon.
The blood was a type A, which matched Virginia's blood type. And there was also some .22 caliber shells in the car.
Fearful that Virginia and her sons had met foul play, authorities released their findings to the media and asked for the public's help in locating the missing mother and children.
It was scary for us because Virginia Uden actually was an employee of mine. And so we got to know Virginia and knew her two boys fairly well. People went all over and combed that mountain looking for bodies.
With zero leads, authorities turn back to Virginia's mother, Claire Martin, to see if she can provide any additional insight into her daughter's life. That's when Claire offers a shocking theory.
She was totally convinced that Gerald Uden had killed her daughter and her two sons.
Investigators press Claire for more information about Gerald's relationship with both Virginia and her sons.
Virginia and the boys were a tremendous source of tension in the relationship between Alice and Gerald. And part of that was because Virginia wanted more child support.
Alice wrote really hateful things in correspondence with Virginia. She called Virginia brainless. You tricked my husband into marrying you. And everyone knows you didn't love him. You only did it for the money. There was a lot of hatred between Alice and Virginia. And really, it was not any kind of a fight over Gerald. It was really over money.
On November 14th, 1980, nearly 2 months after Virginia and her sons went missing, investigators request to speak with Gerald and Alice Uden.
We talked to Alice individually. Alice was kind of a basket case at that time. She was crying and emotional and really couldn't answer much.
Gerald, however, visibly resents Claire's accusations.
He became very physically upset, was shaking, and couldn't hold a cup of coffee.
You could see the carotid artery in his neck pulsating, and Larry said that he's covering up something.
I knew right away we had our guy, and that he had something to do with it, with the missing people. We just didn't know what.
Without warning, Gerald abruptly ends the interview, but not before leaving investigators with one final and disturbing thought.
He said that, even if there was a crime, that we couldn't prove it because there was no body.
Coming up, the case is sent spiraling in a new direction when an informant comes forward with a shocking allegation.
We're here today to give you a chance. We know where he is because we have him now.
More than 5 months after the mysterious disappearances of Virginia Uden and her 2 sons, Richard and Reagan, investigators with the Fremont County Sheriff's Office have received information from Virginia's mother, Claire Martin, who believes Virginia and her sons were murdered by her ex-husband, Gerald Uden.
Claire Martin felt in her bones that Gerald Uden played a role in the disappearance. I believe that she knew deep in her heart that they had been killed.
Despite their suspicions, investigators are unable to find any evidence connecting Gerald or his wife Alice to the disappearances.
There's absolutely no evidence, and their hands were tied.
Years pass without any new leads.
Claire was doing everything in her power to find her family. We all suspected the same thing. At that point, we didn't have it, as far as the law requires.
In 1982, citing police pressure and suspicion from their neighbors, Alice and Gerald suddenly sell their Wyoming farm and move 1,100 miles to Chadwick, Missouri.
Honestly, when we moved to Missouri, I don't think I understood all of it. I was 8 years old.
For 12 more years, nothing new materializes in the investigation.
If you understand what's happening in that community at that time, there's just a desperation to understand what happened to this woman and her 2 children.
Then, in 1994, 14 years after Virginia and her boys went missing, the case takes a sudden and unexpected turn when an informant comes forward with a bombshell allegation. The informant is Alice Uden's oldest son, Todd Scott, and he tells police that his mother had once confessed to being involved in a murder. But to everyone's surprise, it's not the murder of Virginia or her sons.
Todd Scott, who was one of the children of Alice Uden, knew his mother had killed her husband, Ronald Holtz. And he knew that because she told him that she did.
Investigators learn that Ron Holtz, a Vietnam War veteran, had been Alice's 3rd husband. The two had met and married in 1974 after a whirlwind romance that began in a psychiatric hospital.
She'd been his psych nurse. She was sympathetic to the trauma that he suffered in Vietnam. And, she thought she could, save him or whatever.
I believe I was 2 or so when she married Ron.
According to Todd, Alice and Ron's marriage was tumultuous from the start.
Ron had abused Alice. Ron had a very volatile history.
Todd explains that Alice had initially told everyone she had kicked Ron out when she filed for divorce in December of 1974. Ron had never contested the divorce. In fact, no one had ever seen or heard from Ron Holtz again.
Disappearing was completely in keeping with his character. That was the reputation he had.
But years later, Alice had told her son a very different story about what really happened to his former stepfather.
One night, he was about 14 or 15. His mom had been drinking, and she was feeling a little bit emotional, and she told him that years earlier, when she'd been married to Ron, he'd been very abusive, and she was afraid of him. And so one night when he was sleeping, she got her .22, and she shot him in the back of the head while he was in bed. She had taken his body out of the trailer, put him in a barrel, and thrown him down the abandoned gold mine in the Remount Ranch.
His mother had told him that Ron had been abusive and deserved what he got.
Todd, for a very, very long time, carried what had to be an enormous burden. And he just eventually had to get this off of his shoulders.
Investigators dig into Todd's claim and discover that there's no paper trail for Ron Holtz since the winter of 1974, when Alice had told her family she'd left Ron.
His Social Security, for instance, had no activity. A man who had been in and out of mental hospitals for years had no more medical reports. They were pretty convinced that Ron Holtz probably was no longer alive.
Investigators theorize that if Alice had killed her third husband, it increased the likelihood that she and potentially Gerald were responsible for what happened to Virginia and her sons. They widened the scope of their investigation to focus on finding the remains of Ron Holtz. Coordinating with police in Cheyenne, Wyoming, detectives launch a search of Remount Ranch.
Everybody knew that abandoned mine shaft was there, and commonly when there would be an animal that would die on the ranch, they would dispose of the remains down the mine shaft.
At one time, the hole had been 90 feet deep, maybe a dozen feet across. The surrounding dirt and rocks were unstable. Sending anybody down there would be difficult.
Without the proper resources, investigators must call off the search. And just like the unsolved investigation into what happened to Virginia Uden and her sons, the search for Ron Holtz hits a brick wall.
We had nothing else to go on. No new information. No bodies were discovered. So it became a cold case. It was very frustrating. It was always on our minds.
11 more years pass with no leads for either case. Then, in 2005, both Virginia Uden and Ron Holtz's unsolved cases receive renewed interest.
It's several years later when a Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation investigator begins to look through the cold case files.
At the time, I was a special agent for the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation. My role in this case is one of the investigators.
The cold case team decides to focus their efforts on Alice Uden.
We're going to interview her, have a conversation, and find out what happened, if she would give us more insight into the murder of Ron Holtz.
On January 18th, 2005, detectives with the Cold Case Task Force make the surprise visit to Gerald and Alice's home in Chadwick, Missouri.
Gerald had become a trucker, and at the time, Gerald is on the road on a trucking assignment. When they knock on the front door, Alice answers, Alice is a kind of grandmotherly type at that point. They ask her if she'll answer a few questions, which she does. Alice seems to think nothing about it. She even invites him inside. They bring up her past relationships, and she goes down the list of husbands that she'd had, but she conveniently leaves out Ron Holtz.
When Alice neglects to mention Ron, the detectives ask her directly about her third husband, and her reaction is telling.
When confronted with the name Ron Holtz, she falls out of her chair, half fainting.
Cold case agents with the Wyoming Department of Criminal Investigations have just caught Alice Uden off guard after confronting her about the disappearance of her third husband, Ron Holtz, more than 30 years earlier.
When they bring up the story that she had supposedly told her son about shooting a guy named Ron, she defended herself as saying, "Oh no, that didn't happen. I just made it up as a kind of cautionary tale." Alice claims that Ron was abusive and that she kicked him to the curb and divorced and moved on.
With no physical evidence to prove Alice wrong, investigators end their interview. DCI agents next speak with Alice's youngest daughter, Erica Hayes. When they ask her about the claims surrounding her former stepfather's death, Erica admits that her mother had recently contacted her.
My mom found out that my brother Todd had told on her. She said, "You're gonna hear that I killed somebody." And I went, "Did you?" And she said, "Yes, I did. Because I was protecting you."
Investigators also ask Erica if she knows what happened to Gerald's third ex-wife, Virginia Uden, and her two sons, Richard and Reagan. Erica tells agents she doesn't know, but she has a theory on who is responsible for their disappearances.
She suspected Gerald was involved with the disappearance of Virginia and the boys, but she didn't believe her mother was involved.
Investigators press Erica to explain her theory, and her response is unsettling.
Erica Hayes is talking to her parents, and Gerald makes an offhand statement, "You gotta have some pigs to get rid of the body." And for the uninitiated who haven't spent a lot of time around pigs, they eat just about everything.
Erica says at the time she brushed off Gerald's comments as some kind of twisted joke, but she now fears that Virginia and her sons may have suffered a similar fate.
At the time that Virginia and the boys went missing in 1980, Alice and Gerald Uden had property where their home was, and they also had some pigs.
Armed with this new theory, agents head back to the Uden's old farm in Wyoming.
We did a search warrant on Gerald's house.
We basically excavated and screened about 200 square meters of that hog pen looking for human remains.
We turned the place upside down. We didn't come up with any evidence.
Once again, the investigation appears to be at a standstill. 8 years pass without any new leads or developments. Then, on April 4th, 2013, Virginia's mother, Claire, passes away.
Claire Martin died at the age of 92, never finding justice for her daughter and grandsons.
I know that Claire Martin never rested. She always was wanting the answers behind what happened to Virginia and Richard and Reagan.
Everybody wanted her to have that closure so she could go to her final resting place knowing this was over. And unfortunately, she didn't get that.
For several of the Wyoming DCI agents working on Virginia's cold case, Claire's death strengthens their resolve to solve the 2-decade-old investigation. Miraculously, they get a new break just a few months later.
A bigger team returns to the Remount Ranch and to that abandoned gold mine.
After a day and a half of searching, the crew finds what they've been looking for.
They find the pieces of a barrel, and inside that they find a human skeleton. And in the back of the skull of this skeleton was a neat little bullet hole, probably caused by a .22 caliber gun.
The discovery matches the story that Alice's children had told police. To verify whether the bones belong to Ron Holtz, agents are able to track down Ron's biological daughter from his first marriage.
They find her in Alaska, and they dispatch a state trooper to draw her DNA to compare to Ron Holtz's, and it's a match.
The discovery of Ron's remains are enough for police to arrest Alice Uden for his murder on September 26, 2013.
They got a warrant, went to Missouri, and arrested her while Gerald was out. He was a long-haul trucker.
Once in custody, the 74-year-old denies any role in the murder.
She claims she didn't even know who Ron Holtz was, and we knew that that was a lie.
It was at about that time that Agent Tina Trimble from the Division of Criminal Investigation pulled out a photograph of a skull, Ronald Holtz's, and showed it to Alice.
You know who that is? No. This is Ron Holtz. Is it? We're here today to give you a chance. Okay? We know where he is because we have him now.
The evidence convinces Alice to finally admit the truth.
Yeah, he was threatening to kill Erica because she cried. She was just a little girl. I was screaming, and he ran, said he was going to kill her, and I put up my .22 rifle and shot him in the back of the head.
What happened then? How did he get into that hole?
I put him there. Got him into a barrel and rolled him to my car to the back door and put him in the trunk and took him up to the mine and put him in there. You gonna take me to jail?
Yes, I am. Here's what I'm asking. If we can go to the prosecutor and tell them that you told the whole truth, because I know you're not telling the whole truth, okay? I know that they're looking to figure out what happened to Virginia and those boys.
Yes.
So what about Virginia and the boys?
I've told you everything I know about them.
What has Gerald told you about it?
Nothing.
Alice was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder for killing Ron Holtz.
We were hoping that that arrest would have enough of an impact that maybe Gerald would want to talk about Virginia and Richard and Reagan. We're given the opportunity to give Gerald a phone call. And in this phone call, we told Gerald, essentially, that Alice had been arrested for the things that happened in Wyoming. We didn't tell him what. He agreed to drive back to meet with us. And it was our hope as investigators that he would use that drive to let his mind wander. And we were hoping he would allow himself to give the truth. Gerald wanted to talk to us. He literally started his conversation off with telling us that he doesn't know why we arrested Alice, because we arrested the wrong person.
Coming up, after 3 decades, investigators finally uncover what really happened to Virginia Uden and her sons.
That fast. It was 10 seconds, and they were gone.
And newfound evidence suggests the body count may continue to rise.
We had these remains exhumed because we wanted to determine if in fact he had been poisoned.
Wyoming DCI agents have arrested Alice Uden for the 39-year-old murder of her third husband, Ron Holtz, after finding his remains at the bottom of an abandoned gold mine. Both Alice and her husband, Gerald, remain suspects in the unsolved disappearances of Gerald's ex-wife, Virginia Uden, and her 2 sons.
At the time Alice is arrested, Gerald is on the road on a trucking assignment. When Gerald finally arrives home, agents meet him. They tell him Alice has been arrested and they'd like to talk to him a little bit more about what he knows.
I don't know how she could know anything about it, really, because she had nothing really to do with it. 33 years, I have said no, I never did nothing. But now that you guys are here, I've got to assume that you must have either found some bodies or you've done something else. And I gotta tell you, if you found bodies, that's a miracle.
He apparently thought she'd been arrested for Virginia and the boys, and he said, well, she didn't do it, I did it.
They were startled, they were incredulous, but they kept their cool and let Gerald talk.
And he proceeded to paint a picture of what he perceived Virginia to be like. He felt that Virginia was after him strictly to get child support.
Gerald claims that Alice had been particularly upset that he had to pay child support to Virginia, even though he had adopted both boys prior to their divorce.
Alice was raising a little havoc about that, because why should we be paying child support for these 2 boys and they're not yours, and you need to do something about it and take care of it.
I was paying her $150 a month. I'm trying to juggle 2 women, and it ain't flying.
No.
And so finally, it just went off. And I said, I've had it. I'm going to solve this problem. And so I did.
Gerald tells police that on September 12, 1980, he lured Virginia to meet him under the premise of taking her sons, Richard and Reagan, dove hunting.
Gerald says Virginia and the boys come to the medium a little before 2 o'clock on the 12th, and the boys are excited to see him, and he jumps in the passenger seat and directs Virginia to just drive up this dirt road to a point that he knows where they can safely shoot the gun. She drives to that place and they stop. The kids get out.
Virginia was there, the gun was there, I was there, and I shot her right square in the back of the head, and she went down. Richard was standing behind the station wagon, and I whirled and I shot him in the back of the head.
At this point, Reagan realized things were going south quickly and took off running.
He tripped and he fell in the ditch, and I walked over to him and I shot him once. And they were all 3 dead. That fast. It was 10 seconds, and they were gone.
He said he put them in steel drums, like an oil drum. He poked holes in the drum He took them and put them in a boat and went out onto Fremont Lake, which is a natural, deep, clear water lake, and submerged the barrels in that lake.
Just a travesty that Virginia and the boys were killed.
It's sad because we've got two little boys that never got to get married or get a job or raise a family of their own.
Gerald says he later disposed of the gun and tried to make Claire's station wagon disappear.
I tried to roll it over the damn cliff, and you think it would go over the cliff?
Not so much.
Not so much. I didn't get any pleasure out of doing it. None. But it did stop the child support, and that was going to come to about $16,000.
The agents asked Gerald if Alice played any role in this, and he denied that she did.
Nowhere in that statement does he ever acknowledge the wrongfulness of murdering Virginia or Richard or Reagan.
He didn't show any remorse. Nothing like that. He just kind of a matter of fact, nonchalant. I did this, did this, did this.
When he was done, they arrested him and took him to jail. 33 years after Gerald killed Virginia and the boys on that roadside, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder.
The day that I truly realized that, yes, he had committed these murders was the day of his arrest.
On November 1st, 2013, 71-year-old Gerald Uden agrees to plead guilty to the murders of Virginia and her sons.
The judge accepted Gerald's plea deal, and he was sentenced to 3 life sentences.
Alice, however, decides to try her fate at trial. But before court proceedings begin, a tip comes in to suggest Ron Holtz may not have been the first husband that Alice had killed.
There's a belief that my dad was her first victim.
After nearly 40 years of eluding authorities, justice has finally caught up with accused killers Alice and Gerald Uden. For the murders of his ex-wife Virginia and 2 adopted sons, Richard and Reagan, 72-year-old Gerald has been given 3 life sentences. 75-year-old Alice is still awaiting trial for the murder of her ex-husband, Ron Holtz. But before court proceedings begin, police receive a tip that suggests Ron Holtz may not have been Alice's first victim.
Alice's second husband, named Don Prunty, died at age 45 from a whole array of illnesses that stemmed from his alcoholism.
I know that my dad was an alcoholic, and the death certificate says alcoholism. They had no reason to do an autopsy. There is a belief, however, that my mom poisoned my dad. There's a belief that my dad was her first victim.
Following up on the tip, police re-examined Don Prunty's medical records from the months leading up to his death in 1973.
Alice had remarked she was giving Don something that would stop his drinking. The symptoms that were described in Prunty's medical records were consistent with poisoning, specifically by antifreeze.
We had Mr. Prunty's remains exhumed. Unfortunately, he'd been embalmed, and so we weren't able to extract anything from his remains that would have helped us determine if, in fact, our hypothesis was correct and that Alice had been poisoning him.
Though Don Prunty's cause of death remains unclear, Alice's trial for the 1974 murder of Ron Holtz gets underway in May of 2014.
Using the testimony of Todd Scott, we were able to also establish our theory of the case, which was Ronald Holtz was laying in bed sleeping when he was shot in the back of the head with a .22 rifle by his wife, Alice.
The defense counters by saying Alice acted in defense of herself and her daughter.
This was Wyoming of the 1970s. There was no 911. Women didn't have shelters. So she took matters into her own hands, she said.
On May 8, 2014, the jury retires to deliberate. It takes them 13 hours to reach a verdict.
In the end, the jury acquitted Mrs. Uden of first-degree murder, but they did convict her of second-degree.
They believed that she shot him, and the jury didn't believe it was premeditated.
Alice is sentenced to life in prison. 5 years later, she dies in prison at the age of 80.
Her death was welcomed, 'cause I hated seeing her in prison. I did. No matter what she did, I loved her. I loved her so much.
But just 2 days after Alice passes away, Gerald recants his confession to killing Virginia and her sons.
When Alice died, he used that as an opportunity to capitalize on, now that she's gone, I can put everything on her.
I talked to him on the phone and I told him, I said, I know what you did. So just stop. Stop. Because I will not have you putting all this on her. Have some respect for your dead wife.
In September 2019, the court rejects Gerald's attempt to withdraw his guilty plea.
His hands are absolutely not clean. I mean, he was, I totally believe that he killed Virginia and the two boys and was every bit in on every bit of it as much as she was.
I genuinely looked at Alice as a person in our society who looked at killing people as a solution to a problem. I think with Gerald and with Alice, we have a perfect storm of a sociopath and a narcissistic person.
I think the relationship between Alice and Gerald was unique in that these were two profoundly evil people who found one another.
The accident was supposed to be the end of the story. A young woman was struck on an Oklahoma road. She was badly injured. 5 days later, she was dead. Police thought they were investigating a tragic hit-and-run. They had no idea they had just opened the door to one of the darkest identity mysteries in American criminal history. The woman was known as Tanya Hughes. Her husband was known as Clarence Hughes. Her 6-year-old son was Michael. But none of those names told the full truth. And more than 2 decades would pass before investigators understood just how deeply the lies went. Tanya was only 20 years old when the vehicle struck her in Oklahoma City in April 1990. She was taken to a hospital with severe injuries. The circumstances surrounding the collision immediately raised questions, but the investigation moved to the machinery of an ordinary fatal hit-and-run. A woman had been walking near a roadway. A vehicle had struck her. Witnesses had found her. She had been taken for treatment. Then she died. And with her death, the man beside her disappeared. Clarence Hughes claimed to be her husband. He also claimed to be the biological father of her young son. But investigators soon discovered something that would change everything. Clarence Hughes was not Clarence Hughes. He was Franklin Delano Floyd, a fugitive, a man with a criminal history, a man who had been wanted for years, and a man who had built his life around aliases, deception, and disappearing before anyone could ask too many questions. The accident had not exposed him completely. Not yet. But it had cracked the surface. Tanya Hughes was not who people believed she was. Her husband was not who he claimed to be, and the child standing at the center of it all would soon vanish. The first shock came after Tanya's death. Floyd surrendered Michael to Oklahoma authorities and disappeared. The boy was placed into foster care. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Michael might finally have a chance at an ordinary childhood. But the past was already moving toward him. A blood test was conducted to determine whether Floyd was Michael's biological father. He wasn't. The man who had claimed the boy as his son had no biological connection to him. That discovery mattered, because Floyd wanted Michael back. And in 1993, after leaving prison, he began pursuing custody. The child welfare system had questions. Floyd had answers. And behind those answers was a history almost impossible to comprehend. The woman Michael called his mother had herself been taken as a child. The identity Tanya Hughes had been living under was only one name in a chain of aliases stretching back decades. Investigators would eventually discover that Tanya Hughes had actually been Suzanne Marie Savakis. She had been born in Michigan in 1969. As a child, she crossed paths with Floyd. Then she disappeared into his world. He used different names, different stories, different identities. And Suzanne grew up inside that deception. Years later, she would become known as Sharon Marshall, then Tanya Hughes. The names changed. The man remained. And the pattern remained. By the time Tanya died in 1990, almost nobody around her understood who she really was. Not her neighbors. Not the people who knew her casually. Not the authorities investigating her death. And certainly not the public. The truth would take 24 years to emerge. But before investigators discovered Suzanne Savakis beneath the name Tanya Hughes, another mystery became even more urgent. Michael Hughes was missing. In September 1994, Michael was 6 years old. He attended Indian Meridian Elementary School in Choctaw, Oklahoma. He was in first grade. It was an ordinary school day until Franklin Floyd walked through the doors. He was carrying a gun. He forced the school principal, James Davis, to take him to Michael. The principal had no way of knowing what was coming. Floyd took Michael. He also forced Davis into his vehicle. Then he drove away. The principal was eventually left restrained in a wooded area. Michael was gone. The school had been turned into a crime scene. A 6-year-old boy had been abducted in broad daylight, and the man who took him had vanished. The case exploded. Investigators searched. Authorities issued alerts. Witnesses were questioned, and Floyd became the target of a nationwide search. 2 months later, he was arrested in Louisville, Kentucky, but Michael was not with him. There was no child, no body, no confirmed location, no answer. Only a terrifying question. Where was Michael Hughes? For years, that question remained unanswered. Floyd was prosecuted for kidnapping and eventually received a lengthy federal prison sentence. But he would not explain what happened to Michael. That silence became one of the defining mysteries of the case. Some stories emerged, some alleged statements, some possible locations. Some claims that Michael had been killed. Others suggested the boy might still be alive. But nothing could be independently confirmed. The child remained missing. The mother remained an unresolved mystery. And Floyd remained behind bars. Then, more than 20 years after Michael disappeared, investigators returned to the case. The FBI reopened the cold case investigation. Special Agent Scott Law began examining the tangled history surrounding Floyd, Tanya Hughes, and Michael. What he found was not simply an old kidnapping. It was a chain of identities, disappearances, false names, unanswered deaths, and one family history that seemed to have been deliberately erased. Investigators began interviewing Floyd in prison. At first, he was reluctant. He was not eager to provide answers. But the agents kept asking questions. They returned to the same subjects. They confronted contradictions. They pressed him about the woman he had called Tanya Hughes. Eventually, something happened. Floyd began talking. He told investigators about a woman named Suzanne Marie Savakis. He described a child taken decades earlier. He revealed information that could be checked against records. And slowly, the impossible began to become possible. Investigators compared the information with court documents. They traced marriages. They followed aliases. They searched old records. Then came DNA. The woman who had died as Tanya Hughes was identified as Suzanne Marie Savakis. 24 years after her death, her true identity was finally established. The woman at the center of the mystery had been missing in plain sight. Her life had been buried beneath false names. And the accident that killed her had inadvertently become the first major crack in Floyd's carefully constructed identity. But the discovery created another question. What had happened to Michael? By then, the boy would have been a grown man. If he were alive, he would no longer be 6. He would be an adult. Somewhere. Possibly carrying a different name. Possibly unaware of the truth. Possibly waiting for answers about a childhood that had disappeared without explanation. But Floyd finally gave investigators an answer. It was horrifying. He said he had killed Michael on the day of the kidnapping. According to the FBI, Floyd said he shot the 6-year-old boy twice in the back of the head. Then he described where he said he had left the body, near the Oklahoma-Texas border, near an interstate exit, a place where thousands of vehicles could pass without anyone noticing what had been buried nearby. Investigators went there. The FBI evidence response team joined anthropologists from the University of Oklahoma. The search area was narrowed. The ground was examined. Soil was sifted. The investigators knew that after 2 decades, almost nothing might remain. They hoped for physical evidence. A shell casing. A fragment. Something belonging to a child. Anything capable of transforming a confession into proof. They searched for days. Nothing was found. The earth gave them no answer. Michael Hughes remained missing. And that is where the case becomes even more haunting. Because one mystery had been solved. The identity of Tanya Hughes had been uncovered. The identity of Franklin Floyd had been exposed. Floyd had confessed to killing Michael. But the physical evidence remained absent. The boy himself remained absent. There was no grave. No recovered remains. No final place where a family could stand and say, "This is where he is. This is where his story ends." Instead, there was only a confession from a convicted killer whose history was filled with deception. A confession investigators believed was significant. A confession that finally answered a question that had haunted the case for decades. But a confession that still left the most tangible evidence missing. And then came the final silence. Franklin Floyd died in prison on January 23rd, 2023. He was 79 years old. He took many secrets with him. Some had been exposed. Some had been confirmed. Others remained beyond reach. The woman called Tanya Hughes had finally been restored to her real identity. Suzanne Marie Savakis. A daughter. A mother. A young woman whose life had been controlled by a man who had stolen her identity when she was a child. Her son Michael had never been found. The accident had exposed the man. The cold case had exposed the identity. The confession had exposed the alleged fate of the boy. But the ground never gave Michael back. And that is why the story still refuses to disappear. Because somewhere beneath the aliases, the prison records, the old photographs, the courtroom documents, the missing person posters, and the decades of unanswered questions, there was once a 6-year-old boy, Michael Hughes, a child who walked into school one September morning, a child who expected to go home, a child who never did. And more than 30 years later, there is still no grave with his name on it, no recovered remains, no final photograph of where he was laid to rest, only the memory of a little boy carrying a backpack into an ordinary school day, unaware that the man waiting for him had already decided how his story would end. Franklin Floyd spent decades controlling the narrative. He changed names. He changed locations. He changed stories. But he could not erase every trace. The accident exposed one identity. The investigation exposed another. DNA restored a stolen name. And a prison interview finally forced a confession from a man who had refused to speak for years. Yet, even after all of that, one question remains buried somewhere along the highways of Oklahoma. Where is Michael Hughes? The answer may be hidden beneath soil no one has searched. It may be lost forever. Or there may still be one person who knows. One witness. One forgotten conversation. One overlooked piece of evidence. One memory that has survived 30 years of silence. Because cold cases do not always die. Sometimes they wait. They wait inside old records. Inside photographs. Inside names that do not match. Inside accidents that were never quite what they seemed. And sometimes they wait inside the memories of people who believe the past was finally buried. Franklin Floyd is dead, but the mystery left behind is not. The woman called Tanya Hughes has her name back. Michael Hughes still does not have his final resting place. And somewhere between those two facts lies the darkest legacy of the case. A mother whose true identity took 24 years to recover. A child whose disappearance took decades to become a murder investigation. And a man whose carefully constructed life began to collapse because of an accident that was never supposed to reveal anything at all. The road gave investigators the first clue. Time gave them the second. DNA gave them the truth about Tanya. And Floyd's own words gave them the story of Michael. But the final piece remains missing. The body of a 6-year-old boy. Until that piece is found, Michael Hughes remains more than a name in a cold case database. He remains a missing child, a photograph, a question, a silence, and a story that refuses to end. The silence surrounding Michael Hughes was not the silence of an ordinary missing person case. It was a silence created when the person most capable of explaining what happened was also the person investigators had the greatest reason to distrust. Franklin Floyd knew where the boy had gone. He knew what happened after the school doors closed behind them. He knew which roads he had taken, what he had carried, what he had left behind, and what he had refused to say for years. Yet every answer from Floyd had to be measured against a lifetime of deception, because this was a man who had made false identities part of his existence. He had been Clarence Hughes. He had been other names. He had lived behind documents that did not belong to him. He had taken a child into his custody under circumstances that were themselves built on lies. And now, after decades of silence, he was telling investigators that the little boy was dead. But a confession is not the same thing as a recovered child. That distinction became painfully important. Investigators had a story. They had a location. They had a description of what Floyd claimed he had done. What they did not have was the one thing that could end the search with certainty: Michael's remains. The search near the Oklahoma-Texas border became another chapter in a case already crowded with unanswered questions. Investigators worked with specialists who understood that 20 years could transform a crime scene. Weather could destroy evidence. Animals could scatter remains. Construction could disturb soil. Vegetation could conceal what once might have been visible. Roads could change. Land could be altered. A location that looked isolated in the early 1990s might no longer resemble itself decades later. And Floyd's memory had to be considered as well. Was he telling the truth? Was he giving investigators the actual location? Was he remembering correctly? Was he deliberately manipulating them? Or was the confession itself another attempt to control the story? Those questions mattered because Floyd had spent his entire life controlling information. He understood that information was power. If investigators needed him to answer one question, he could answer another. If they believed one identity, he could produce another. If they followed one trail, he could disappear down a different road. Now, he was an old man in federal custody. The world had changed. Technology had changed. Investigative methods had changed. But Floyd still possessed something investigators wanted: information. For decades, the identity of Tanya Hughes had been one of the case's greatest mysteries. She had died young, leaving behind a child and a husband whose identity was false. Her death had initially appeared to be a tragedy involving a pedestrian and a vehicle. But as investigators reconstructed her past, the story became increasingly disturbing. Tanya Hughes had been Suzanne Marie Savakis. That discovery transformed the case. Suzanne had disappeared from her original family when she was a child. The trail eventually led investigators toward Floyd, who had become deeply connected to her life. The details were disturbing not because they formed a single shocking moment, but because they showed how an entire human identity could be gradually buried beneath another person's control. A new name, a new location, a new story. Then another. By the time Suzanne became Tanya Hughes, the original identity had almost vanished. Almost. There were still records. There were still photographs. There were still people who remembered the little girl she had once been. And there was DNA. Modern forensic science did what decades of paperwork could not. It connected the woman who died in Oklahoma to the child who had disappeared years earlier. For her family, the revelation was devastating. They had not simply lost a daughter. They had lost her identity. For years, they did not know where she had gone. Then they learned that the young woman who had died under another name was the child they had been searching for. The truth arrived decades late, and with it came another terrible realization. Michael Hughes had been living inside the same web of deception. He was the son at the center of the story. He was a child who knew Floyd as a father. He had known Tanya as his mother. But even those relationships were surrounded by uncertainty. Floyd was not his biological father. Tanya's identity had been concealed. And when Tanya died, Michael was left without the people he believed were his family. Then Floyd came back for him. The 1994 abduction was not random. Floyd went directly to the school. He knew where Michael was. He knew where the boy studied. He knew how to reach him. The principal was forced to assist him. The child was taken. And then Michael disappeared. The event stunned the local community because it happened in a place parents were supposed to trust. A school. A place filled with teachers, children, routine, security. The normal rhythm of an ordinary morning. Then suddenly, a gunman had walked inside. A child had been taken. And within hours, the question had spread far beyond Oklahoma. Michael Hughes was missing. Photographs were circulated. Authorities searched. Investigators followed leads. Floyd became one of the most wanted men connected to the case. And yet the boy remained invisible. No confirmed sighting. No verified message. No telephone call from a frightened child. No physical evidence establishing where Michael had gone. Just absence. That absence became the central fact of the investigation. As the years passed, Michael's face remained frozen in childhood. That is one of the cruelest realities of a long-term missing person case. The world moves forward. The child does not. A 6-year-old photograph remains 6 years old while the calendar continues. Friends grow older. Teachers retire. Buildings change. Neighborhoods disappear. People who once knew the case move away or die. Evidence deteriorates. Memories become uncertain. But the photograph remains. Michael's face continued to exist in the public record as a child, even as the man he might have become, if alive, was already somewhere in adulthood. That possibility haunted investigators. Could Michael have survived? Could he have been given another name? Could he have been raised somewhere without knowing his real identity? Could someone have seen him years later without recognizing him? These possibilities were difficult to dismiss completely until Floyd finally made his confession. But even then, the case did not become simple. Floyd claimed Michael was dead. He described a killing. He provided a location. Investigators searched. And they found nothing. That single fact created an unsettling tension that never completely disappeared. A confession had answered the question of what Floyd said happened. It did not provide independent physical confirmation. For investigators, the difference was crucial. The search had to continue. The evidence had to be evaluated. Every detail had to be tested against what could actually be established. And the deeper investigators looked into Floyd's past, the more they found a man capable of extraordinary deception. He had escaped custody before. He had used aliases. He had manipulated authorities. He had constructed identities that survived for years. The name Clarence Hughes had seemed real to people around Tanya, but it was a disguise. The marriage was real in the sense that people believed it existed. The identity was not. And that realization forced investigators to reconsider everything. If Floyd had lied about who he was, what else had he lied about? If he had hidden Suzanne's identity, what else had been hidden? If he had abducted Michael, where had the child really gone? Every answer opened another question. And every question led back to Floyd. His history stretched across decades. The crimes associated with him were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern of movement, deception, violence, and disappearance. He was always somewhere else. Always under another name. Always leaving behind people who knew only part of the story. That may have been his greatest protection. Not secrecy. Fragmentation. One person knew him as Clarence. Another knew him under another name. Someone else knew Tanya. Someone else remembered Suzanne. A school knew Michael as a student. Authorities knew Floyd as a fugitive. Each piece existed separately. The truth required putting them together. And for years, nobody had the complete picture. That changed slowly. An accident created the first crack. A death created questions. A blood test challenged the claimed fatherhood. A school kidnapping transformed those questions into a national investigation. DNA restored a woman's identity. And finally, a prison interview connected the pieces. But the case still contained a void. Michael, the child who had been taken. The child whose mother had already died. The child whose alleged killer was the man who had claimed to protect him. The child whose remains could not be located. Even after Floyd's confession, investigators could not simply close the emotional wound. There was no funeral, no grave, no final photograph, no place where relatives could stand and say goodbye. There was only a confession and an empty search site. For the family of Suzanne Savakis, the discovery of her true identity brought an answer they had waited decades to receive. But the answer came with another loss. They learned where Suzanne had gone. They learned that she had died young. They learned that the name she had been known by was not the name she had been born with. And they were left with the question of her son, the little boy connected to the final years of her life. Michael Hughes. His story became inseparable from hers. Mother and son, both trapped in the same false identity, both connected to the same man. One recovered through DNA. One never recovered at all. And that contrast is what makes this case so haunting. Suzanne's identity could be reconstructed from evidence left behind. Michael's fate depended largely on the words of a man whose entire history demanded skepticism. The years did not make the mystery easier. They made it harder. Because every year created more distance between the crime and the possibility of finding physical evidence. More distance between witnesses and memories. More distance between Michael's childhood and whatever adult life he might have had. And eventually, more distance between the investigators and the man who claimed to know the truth. Franklin Floyd grew old behind bars. The world outside continued. Technology advanced. Investigators developed new methods. Cold cases once considered impossible began to yield answers through DNA and genetic genealogy. Old photographs were enhanced. Databases expanded. Records became searchable. But Michael's case remained stubbornly incomplete. Then Floyd died. And with his death came the final realization that there would be no more interviews, no more confrontations, no more opportunities to challenge his story, no chance to ask him one more time where he had taken the boy, no chance of walking back through the roads, no chance to demand that he identify one more landmark, one more tree, one more turn, one more place. Whatever Floyd truly knew about Michael died with him, and the case was left with the evidence that remained. The records, the confession, the memories, the photographs, the unanswered search, and the image of a 6-year-old boy whose disappearance had begun inside an elementary school and continued for more than 3 decades. Sometimes the most frightening cold cases are not the ones where investigators have no suspects. They are the ones where they know exactly who the suspect was. They know his name. They know his history. They know his lies. They know his crimes. They even have his confession. And still, they cannot find the child. That is the unfinished nightmare of Michael Hughes. A case that began with a woman dying beneath a name that was not hers. A case that revealed a man living beneath a name that was not his. A case that exposed a stolen identity. A vanished childhood. A kidnapping. A confession. And a search that ended with empty ground. More than 20 years after the accident that first drew attention to Tanya Hughes, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. But truth did not mean closure. Because closure requires somewhere to go. A grave. A final answer. A place where the search can stop. Michael Hughes has none of those. His name remains suspended between the past and the present. His childhood photograph remains. His disappearance remains. And somewhere beyond the final page of the official record, one question continues to echo through the years. If Franklin Floyd told the truth about what happened to Michael, then where did he leave him? And if he did not tell the whole truth, what part of the story is still missing? That question survived Floyd. It survived the investigators. It survived the searches. It survived the changing roads and passing decades. And as long as Michael Hughes remains unrecovered, the case remains open in the only way that truly matters. The story is not finished. The silence is not an answer. And somewhere inside that silence may still be the last piece of a mystery that began with an accident, exposed a stolen identity, and revealed a darkness that had remained hidden for more than 20 years. The most disturbing thing about the Michael Hughes case may be what happened after the world finally learned the truth about Tanya Hughes. For years, investigators have been searching for a missing child. Then they discovered that the child had been born into a story that was already broken before anyone knew he existed. His mother was living under a stolen identity. The man claiming to be his father was using a false name, and the family history surrounding them had been deliberately obscured. Suddenly, the disappearance of one 6-year-old boy could no longer be viewed as an isolated kidnapping. It was a final visible piece of a much larger pattern. That pattern began long before the Oklahoma school. It began when Suzanne Marie Savakis was still a child. Her life was altered before she was old enough to understand what was happening. Franklin Floyd entered that life and eventually became one of the most important figures in it. But he was not simply a guardian or a family acquaintance. He became the person around whom the family's identities began to fracture. Names changed. Addresses changed. Stories changed. And as Suzanne grew older, the person she had once been became increasingly difficult to find. That is what makes the later discovery so chilling. Investigators were not merely identifying an unknown woman. They were reconstructing a life that had been intentionally fragmented. Every record mattered. Every photograph mattered. Every childhood memory mattered. A name written on an old document could suddenly become evidence. A photograph could become a bridge between two identities. A DNA sample could connect a woman who died in Oklahoma to a family that had spent decades wondering where their daughter had gone. The science was precise. The human story was not, because Suzanne had lived for years without the freedom to simply be Suzanne. By the time she became Tanya Hughes, the transformation was complete enough that almost everyone around her accepted the identity. That is the power of a convincing lie. It does not have to fool everyone forever. It only has to survive long enough. And Floyd was very good at making identity survive. When Tanya died, the people around her believed they were mourning one woman. They did not know they were mourning another. Her death certificate carried the wrong name. Her marriage connected her to a man whose own name was false. Her child was placed into the custody of a system that did not yet understand the history surrounding him. And then the story changed again. Michael disappeared. The disappearance was dramatic enough to attract immediate attention, but the deeper mystery remained invisible. Investigators knew they were looking for Franklin Floyd. They knew he had abducted Michael from school. But they did not yet understand that Floyd had been controlling the child's life from the beginning. That discovery came slowly, and by the time arrived, the trail was already cold. The search for Michael became a race against time. In the early days, investigators could still hope for a fresh sighting. Someone might remember a vehicle. Someone might have seen a child. Someone might recognize Floyd. Every telephone call mattered. Every reported sighting had to be investigated. Every possibility had to be considered. But the longer Michael remained missing, the more difficult the search became. A missing child generates urgency. A missing child who has been gone for years generates uncertainty. The face remains the same in the public imagination. The person does not. That distinction would become especially painful in Michael's case. If he had survived, he would have grown up. He would have become a teenager. Then an adult. He would have changed physically beyond recognition. His voice would have changed. His interests would have changed. His memories would have changed. He might have forgotten details from the first years of his life. Or he might have remembered everything. He might have known that the name Michael Hughes was not the name his life had started with. He might have been told another story. or no story at all. For investigators, every possibility had to remain open until evidence closed it. And evidence was exactly what they lacked. The years passed. Floyd remained imprisoned. Michael remained missing. Suzanne's true identity remained unknown to the public. Then technology began to change the way cold cases could be investigated. DNA had already transformed criminal investigations. But decades later, genetic databases and improved forensic techniques offered investigators tools that earlier investigators could not have imagined. The case could be reopened. Old evidence could be examined again. Old identities could be questioned again. And the woman known as Tanya Hughes finally became Suzanne Marie Savakis. It was a breakthrough. But it was also a reminder of how much had been lost. A woman could disappear from her own family's history. A child could become another person on paper. A mother could die under a false name. And for decades, the world could accept the false version. That realization changed the meaning of the original accident. The collision that killed Tanya had been tragic, but it had also been the beginning of exposure. Without that event, Floyd might have continued moving. The false identity might have survived longer. Michael might have remained connected to a story nobody understood. The accident did not solve the case. It opened it. And once investigators started pulling the thread, the entire structure began to unravel. The more they learned about Floyd, the more troubling the timeline became. He had been connected to Suzanne when she was young. He had moved through different identities. He had committed crimes. He had been imprisoned. He had escaped. He had repeatedly manipulated the people around him, and yet he had remained capable of disappearing into ordinary life. That ability was central to the mystery, because criminals often hide by creating distance. Floyd hid by creating confusion. He did not simply disappear. He became someone else. The name changed. The history changed. The explanation changed. And when authorities confronted him, there was always another layer. That is why the identification of Suzanne mattered so much. It stripped away one of those layers. The woman who had been called Tanya Hughes was no longer anonymous. Her real identity had been recovered. And once her identity was recovered, investigators could begin reconstructing the years that had been hidden. They could ask who knew Suzanne, who had seen her, where had she lived, what had happened to her family, how had she become connected to Floyd, what happened to her children. Those questions led directly back to Michael, and Michael led directly back to Floyd. The circle closed, but the center remained empty. Investigators could establish that Michael had been taken. They could establish who had taken him. They could establish that Floyd had eventually confessed. But they could not recover the boy. That absence became the strongest symbol of the case. A confession without remains. A crime without a recovered victim. A mother whose identity had been restored, but whose child was still missing. A killer who had died without providing a final, independently verifiable answer. The search near the border became part of that unresolved history. Investigators went where Floyd said the boy had been left. They examined the ground. They searched for signs. They used specialists. They looked for anything that could survive after so many years. But the land remained silent. No remains were found. No definitive physical evidence emerged. And without that discovery, the family could never experience the kind of closure that comes when a missing person is finally recovered. That is an important distinction. For the law, a confession can carry enormous weight. For a family, the absence of a body creates a different kind of pain. There is nowhere to place flowers, nowhere to visit, nowhere to say goodbye. Only a question. Where is he? For years, that question had been asked in different forms. Where was Michael? Who had taken him? Was he alive? Was he dead? Was Franklin Floyd telling the truth? Was Michael buried somewhere investigators had not searched? Could another witness still know something? Could a forgotten document reveal a missing detail? Every question pointed toward uncertainty. And uncertainty is what makes a cold case so difficult to escape. There is no final moment, no definitive ending, no clean break between the investigation and the aftermath. The case simply continues to exist. In records, in databases, in family memories, in old photographs, and in the minds of investigators who once worked the case. Franklin Floyd's death in 2023 removed the possibility of ever forcing another answer from him. He could no longer be confronted with new evidence. He could no longer be taken back to the search area. He could no longer be asked to explain contradictions. Whatever truth remained inside him was beyond investigators' reach. That does not mean everything he said was false. It does not mean everything he said was true. It means the final test of his story remains incomplete, and that is where the mystery survives. The case is not mysterious because nobody knows anything. It is mysterious because investigators know so much and still lack the one piece that matters most. Michael, the child, the victim, the missing person whose absence has lasted longer than his entire known childhood. Imagine the timeline. Michael was 6 when he disappeared. If he had lived, he would have passed through adolescence. He would have graduated. He might have built friendships. He might have started a career. He might have had children of his own. He might walk through the world completely unaware that somewhere investigators were still looking for him. Or none of that happened. The confession says otherwise. But the physical evidence never arrived to close that final gap. That is the cruel paradox of the case. The world eventually learned the truth about the mother. The world learned the truth about the man who claimed to be the father. But the truth about the child remains incomplete. And perhaps that is why the photograph of Michael remains so powerful. He is forever 6. Forever the child who walked into school. Forever the boy who disappeared. Forever frozen before the years that should have followed. The photograph does not show what happened. It only shows what was lost. A childhood. A family. An identity. A future. And the ordinary life that should have continued after one school day ended. Instead, the trail stopped. And decades later, the question remains. What happened after Franklin Floyd left that school? Where did the vehicle go? Where did the road lead? What happened to Michael in the hours that followed? Did Floyd act alone? Was anyone else involved? Did anyone see something and never understand what they had witnessed? Were there overlooked records? Was the search conducted in exactly the right place? Or was the final location deliberately misrepresented? These questions cannot be answered simply because the man who held the answers is gone. That is the final cruelty of a story. The person who controlled the truth for decades now controls nothing. But he also cannot be questioned. He cannot correct himself. He cannot explain. He cannot lead investigators to another location. And he cannot return Michael. So the case remains suspended between confession and evidence, between certainty and doubt, between what investigators believe and what they can physically prove. The accident that killed Tanya Hughes began the unraveling. The discovery of her true identity changed the case forever. The kidnapping of Michael turned the hidden history into a national mystery. And Floyd's eventual confession revealed the darkest possibility. But even after all those revelations, one fact remains unchanged. Michael Hughes has never been brought home. That is why the case still matters. Not because of the sensational headlines, not because of the aliases, not because of the criminal history, but because behind every document was a real person. Behind every photograph was a real child. And behind every unanswered question was a family waiting for something that may never come. An answer, a location, a grave, a final piece of truth. Until then, Michael remains where the case has left him for more than 3 decades. Somewhere between a missing person photograph and a confession. Somewhere between the last confirmed sighting and the place Franklin Floyd claimed he left him. Somewhere between what investigators know and what they can prove. And that space is where cold cases live. Not in the past, but in the unfinished present. A photograph can fade. A building can disappear. A road can change. A witness can forget. A suspect can die. But a missing child remains missing until the evidence says otherwise. Michael Hughes was 6 years old when he vanished. He deserved the chance to grow older. He deserved a name that was not surrounded by lies. He deserved a life beyond the shadows created by the adults around him. Instead, his name became part of one of America's most disturbing unresolved mysteries. And after all the years, all the searches, all the revelations, and all the questions, there is still only one thing investigators cannot give his family. His final resting place. That empty space remains. And as long as it remains empty, the story of Michael Hughes cannot truly end. There is a strange cruelty in the way this case unfolded. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A name here, a document there, a photograph pulled from an old file, a DNA comparison, a confession made after years of silence. Each discovery seemed to illuminate the darkness, yet every new answer revealed another question waiting behind it. The deeper investigators went, the more they understood that the mystery surrounding Michael Hughes had never been only about one missing boy. It was about an entire life built on falsehoods, and about how difficult it can be to reconstruct the truth after the people who lived it have spent years disappearing behind invented names. For Michael, the story began before he was old enough to understand it. He was born into a world where the adults around him had already created identities that did not belong to them. His mother was known by a name that was not her birth name. The man who claimed to be his father was not his biological father. The family moved through different places and different versions of its own history. To a child, those contradictions would not necessarily look like contradictions. Children believe what the adults tell them. If the man beside you says his name is your father, you believe him. If the woman beside you answers when you call her mom, you believe her. If the family tells you this is where you live, you accept it. Michael had no reason to know that the world around him had been constructed from secrets. Then Tanya died. And suddenly the structure holding his childhood together began to collapse. Michael was placed into foster care. The man he knew as his father disappeared from his immediate life. The authorities began asking questions. And somewhere behind those questions was a reality Michael could not possibly have understood. The adults investigating his mother's death were beginning to discover that almost everything they thought they knew about his family was wrong. The identity of Tanya Hughes was wrong. The identity of Clarence Hughes was wrong. The biological relationship between Floyd and Michael was wrong. And yet the most important question remained unanswered. Where was the boy going to belong? For a short time, the child welfare system became the one stable structure around him. There were records. There were teachers. There were officials. There were people trying to determine what was best for him. But Floyd was not finished. When he eventually sought to regain custody, the authorities had reasons to be cautious. The man asking for the child had already demonstrated that his identity and history were not what they appear to be. And then in 1994, the situation became irreversible. Floyd walked into Michael's school. There was no dramatic warning, no long confrontation, no public announcement. Just a man entering a building where children were supposed to be safe. He had a gun. The principal was forced to cooperate. Michael was taken. And in the span of minutes, the child disappeared from the life that had been built around him. That moment will become one of the most important points on the timeline. Because after that day, every road led back to Floyd. Investigators searched for him. Authorities issued alerts. The case expanded. And eventually Floyd was captured. But Michael was not. That difference became a defining wound. The suspect was found. The victim was not. The investigation could proceed against Floyd. The search for Michael could not end. Years passed. Then more years. The case became a cold case. The phrase sounds clinical. Cold case. 2 words. But behind those words is a terrible reality. A family still waits. A photograph remains in a file. A name remains in a database. An investigator eventually retires. Another investigator takes over. The original witnesses become older. Some die. Some move. Some forget. And the child at the center of the case remains frozen at the age when he disappeared. Michael was 6. He never got to tell investigators what happened. He never got to describe the man who took him. He never got to identify the vehicle. He never got to say where he had been taken. He never got to correct the story. Everything investigators knew had to come from someone else. And the person who claimed to know the truth was Franklin Floyd. That made the investigation extraordinarily difficult. Floyd's statements could not simply be accepted. His history made that impossible. He had lied about his identity. He had committed crimes. He had demonstrated an ability to manipulate people and institutions. He had survived by keeping others uncertain. So when he finally talked about Michael, investigators had to ask the most basic forensic question. Can his story be independently verified? That question led them to the search. The location Floyd provided became a physical test of his words. If he was telling the truth, the ground should contain evidence. If he was lying, the search might expose a lie. Investigators went into the area with specialists. They searched carefully. They looked for human remains and other evidence that might have survived decades underground. But nature does not preserve crime scene for investigators. Soil shifts. Water moves. Animals disturb the ground. Plants grow. Human development changes landscapes. A place that once seemed isolated can become unrecognizable. And when investigators find nothing, the absence itself becomes difficult to interpret. No remains does not necessarily mean the confession was false. But no remains also means a confession cannot provide the same certainty as physical evidence. That distinction remained at the center of the case. Floyd's words pointed in one direction. The ground offered nothing. And the years had already destroyed many of the possibilities investigators once had. Still, the investigation continued in another direction. The woman known as Tanya Hughes. For years, her identity had been a mystery of its own. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was her background so difficult to verify? Why did the man calling himself Clarence Hughes have such a complicated history? The questions eventually led investigators to Suzanne Marie Savakis. Her family had known her by another name. They remembered another childhood. They had another set of photographs. And the DNA evidence created the connection. Tanya Hughes was Suzanne. The discovery was more than a correction in a database. It changed the history of the entire case. Because suddenly, the woman who had been treated as a young mother killed in Oklahoma had a past that could be traced. A childhood, a family, a disappearance, a connection to Floyd, and a son Michael. The case now had a timeline that reached backward far beyond the Oklahoma accident. The accident had not created the mystery. It had exposed it. That distinction matters. Before the collision, Floyd's identity had remained largely hidden. After the collision, authorities began looking at him. After Tanya's death, Michael entered the system. After Michael's kidnapping, Floyd became a wanted fugitive. After his capture, the case entered the courts. And decades later, modern investigation techniques began connecting Tanya to Suzanne. The truth emerged slowly because the deception had been built slowly. Floyd had not created one lie. He had created an ecosystem of lies. And each lie supported another. A false name made another false name possible. A false family history made another disappearance easier to explain. A new location created distance from the old one. Distance created confusion. Confusion created protection. And protection allowed the cycle to continue. That is why investigators had to reconstruct the past almost like an archaeological site. They could not simply ask what happened. They had to ask when each identity appeared. Who used it? Who believed it? What documents supported it? Which records contradicted it? Where did the people involved live? Who knew them? Who remembered them? The case became a map of fragments. And somewhere inside that map was Michael, the boy who had been born into the middle of the deception, the boy who lost his mother, the boy who was taken from school, the boy who disappeared, the boy whose future became a question mark. As investigators rebuilt Suzanne's life, they also confronted the devastating possibility that Michael had never had the opportunity to build an adult life at all. Floyd's confession suggested that the boy had been murdered, but the absence of remains left a gap that could not be ignored. The difference between missing and recovered is enormous. A missing person case carries uncertainty. A recovered victim provides finality. Families may never like the truth. They may never accept it emotionally, but evidence gives them somewhere to place their grief. Michael's family did not have that. They had photographs. They had memories. They had records. They had a confession. But they did not have Michael. That is why the search remained so important even after Floyd admitted killing him. The investigators were not simply trying to prove a theory. They were trying to find a child. Every search was an attempt to turn a name into a location. Every shovel of soil represented the possibility of an answer. Every negative result pushed the answer farther away. And every year made the challenge greater. Eventually, Floyd's age became part of the story. The man who had once run from authorities was no longer running. He was incarcerated. He was old. His body was failing. The world outside had changed dramatically since Michael disappeared. But the unanswered question remained the same. What happened to Michael Hughes? Floyd could have answered it. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he did not. Perhaps his confession contained the truth, but not every detail. Perhaps the location was imperfect. Perhaps the passage of time had distorted his memory. Perhaps he deliberately withheld information. There was no longer any way to know with certainty. That is the nightmare investigators face when a case depends on the words of someone who has spent a lifetime manipulating the truth. The confession may contain the answer, but the confession may also contain another layer of deception. And after the suspect dies, the possibility of clarification disappears. Franklin Floyd died in 2023. The case lost its most important living source of information. There would be no second interrogation. No new confrontation. No final admission. No last-minute revelation. The man was gone. But Michael remained missing, and the silence became permanent. Yet the case still leaves behind something more powerful than silence. It leaves evidence of a life that existed. Suzanne's identity was recovered. Her family history was restored. Her name was no longer buried beneath the alias Tanya Hughes. That matters because criminals can steal names, but they cannot completely erase the people who remember them. A childhood photograph can survive. A birth record can survive. A DNA profile can survive. A relative's memory can survive. And, eventually, those fragments can find one another. That is what happened with Suzanne. The identity that Floyd had helped conceal for decades was recovered. But Michael's story is different. There is no adult identity waiting to be confirmed. No confirmed photograph from later life. No verified address. No known career. No marriage. No children. Nothing that can tell investigators who Michael would have become. Only the 6-year-old boy remains visible. That is the image that time cannot erase. A child. A school. A disappearance. And a name. Michael Hughes. The case therefore remains suspended between two kinds of truth. The first is the truth investigators can establish. Suzanne Marie Savakis was a woman known as Tanya Hughes. Franklin Floyd was the man known as Clarence Hughes. Michael was abducted from his school. Floyd later confessed to killing him. A search based on Floyd's information did not recover Michael's remains. The second truth is the one everyone still wants. Where is Michael? That answer remains hidden. And perhaps that is why the case continues to haunt people who encounter it decades later. It is not simply the story of a criminal who used aliases. It is a story of how one person's deception could distort the lives of multiple people across generations. A stolen identity. A stolen childhood. A stolen future. And a missing grave. The accident that exposed Floyd did not happen on the day Michael disappeared. It happened years earlier. But its consequences continued to unfold long after the wreckage was cleared from the road. That is the strange architecture of this case. One event creates a clue. The clue creates a question. The question exposes an identity. The identity exposes a history. The history leads back to a missing child. And the missing child leads back to a man who eventually dies without giving the world a complete answer. Nothing about the case moves in a straight line. It circles. It doubles back. It disappears. Then, decades later, it returns. That is what makes a cold case so different from an ordinary investigation. The past is never completely gone. It is simply waiting for someone to notice a detail everyone else overlooked. A name that does not match. A photograph that looks familiar. A document that contradicts another document. A biological connection that should not exist. A confession that points to a forgotten piece of land. A memory that suddenly makes sense. And perhaps somewhere in the remaining evidence surrounding Michael Hughes, one such detail still exists. One fragment. One overlooked fact. One piece of information that has not yet been connected to the rest. Because the story of Michael Hughes is not only about what investigators discovered. It is also about what they still have not discovered. And sometimes the missing piece is not buried in the ground. Sometimes it is buried in a memory, in a file, in a photograph, in a name, or in the mind of someone who has never realized that what they know could finally help explain what happened. That possibility is what keeps a case alive. Not hope without evidence. Not speculation. But the simple recognition that the story is incomplete. Michael disappeared when he was 6. His mother was eventually identified decades after her death. The man who claimed to be his father was exposed as Franklin Floyd. The confession came. The search came. The years came. Then Floyd died. But Michael's final location did not. And so the last chapter of the case remains unwritten. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because there is still one question that refuses to disappear. Where is Michael Hughes? Until that question has an answer supported by evidence, the silence surrounding the boy will remain louder than every confession, every headline, and every revelation that came before it. There was another layer to the mystery that investigators could not ignore before Michael became a photograph on a missing child poster, before Tanya Hughes was identified as Suzanne Marie Savakis. There had been years of instability surrounding the family. The people involved had moved through different names in different places, and the records did not always agree. To investigators, that kind of inconsistency is rarely meaningless. A wrong date can be an innocent mistake. A wrong name can be clerical. But when the same people repeatedly appear under different identities, the pattern becomes something else entirely. It becomes a trail. And Floyd had left one. The difficulty was following it backward. Every time investigators believed they had reached the beginning, another name appeared, another address, another document, another version of the past. The further they went, the more they realized that the Oklahoma case was only the visible end of a much longer story. Suzanne had been a child when the relationship with Floyd began. That fact changed the emotional weight of everything that followed. She did not enter adulthood with a clean slate. Her identity had already been disrupted. Her connection to her original family had been broken. The person who became central to her life was also the person whose own identity was unstable. Years later, when she appeared as Tanya Hughes, there was little reason for strangers to question the name. She looked like a young mother. She had a child. She had a husband. She had a home. There was an appearance of normality. And normality can be one of the most effective disguises. People tend to question what looks unusual. They do not question what looks ordinary. That may explain why so much of the deception survived. The family could exist in plain sight. Neighbors could see them. Teachers could interact with them. People could speak to Tanya without realizing that the woman standing in front of them had another identity and another family history. Then the accident happened. And suddenly, normality disappeared. The woman was injured. The hospital became involved. Authorities began asking questions. And when Tanya died, the investigation created a permanent record. Her name was written down. Her death was documented. Her husband was identified. Her child entered official custody. Those records became the first anchors investigators could use years later. Without them, the truth might have been even harder to reconstruct. But the accident also produced something else. Floyd's disappearance. He did not remain beside the grieving family. He did not simply cooperate with authorities and return to an ordinary life. Instead, the man known as Clarence Hughes began moving away from the identity that investigators were starting to examine. And behind that name was Franklin Floyd. The revelation was explosive. The husband of the dead woman was not the man he claimed to be. He had a criminal past. He had reasons to fear authorities. And he had now become connected to a dead woman whose own identity was uncertain. But at that moment, Michael was still alive. He was a little boy. He had just lost his mother. And the adults around him were fighting over what would happen next. Floyd wanted control. Authorities wanted answers. The child welfare system wanted to protect the boy. Michael himself could not possibly understand the larger conflict. Then Floyd's custody efforts intensified. The man who had disappeared after Tanya's death was now trying to reclaim the child. That alone would have been alarming, but the background made it worse. Floyd was not Michael's biological father. He had already used a false identity. He had a criminal record. And yet he was still able to remain connected to the boy. That connection ultimately ended at an elementary school. September 12, 1994. The day began like any other school day. Children arrived. Teachers prepared for classes. The building followed its routine. Nobody expected a kidnapping. Then Franklin Floyd appeared. He was armed. The principal was forced to comply with his demands. Michael was taken. The event was fast, terrifying, and deliberate. The school principal was eventually left behind. Floyd escaped with a child. The search began almost immediately. News spread. Law enforcement agencies became involved. The image of Michael became associated with the word missing. His face entered the public consciousness. But there was a cruel irony. Investigators were looking for a child whose own identity had already been surrounded by uncertainty. The boy was Michael Hughes. But the family history behind that name was complicated. His mother had not been Tanya. His alleged father was not Clarence. And the man who had taken him was Franklin Floyd. 3 names, 3 identities, 1 child, and no reliable destination. When Floyd was eventually arrested in Kentucky, investigators had the man. But they did not have Michael. That was the moment the case became a long-term mystery. A suspect was in custody. The victim was gone. Floyd could have ended the search by telling investigators exactly where Michael was. Instead, the years passed. His silence became another weapon. For the family, every passing year was another year without certainty. For investigators, every passing year meant evidence could disappear. And for Michael, if he was alive, every passing year meant he was growing farther away from the 6-year-old face in photograph. The investigation continued through different stages. There were leads. There were possible sightings. There were theories. But none produced Michael. The public eventually moved on. That is another tragedy of long-term missing person cases. The first weeks can dominate headlines. The first months can produce national attention. But after years, the story becomes part of the background. People forget. New crimes happen. New victims appear. Investigators move to other cases. And the missing child remains frozen in time. Michael's photograph did not change. The world did. By the time investigators began revisiting the deeper history of the case, a generation had grown up without knowing his story. But the FBI did not forget. Cold cases can survive because records survive. An old case file can wait for a new investigator. A new investigator can notice something that an earlier investigator could not. A technology that did not exist in 1990 can become decisive decades later. And that is what happened with the identity of Tanya Hughes. Modern forensic work reopened questions that had once seemed impossible to answer. The woman who died in Oklahoma could finally be connected to her real family. Suzanne Marie Savakis was no longer simply an alias hidden inside an old case file. She was a real person with a documented childhood, a real daughter, a real mother, a real history. And that history placed Floyd at the center of a much darker narrative. For the investigators working the cold case, the identification was not the end. It was an opening. If Tanya was Suzanne, then what had happened to Suzanne before Oklahoma? How had she ended up with Floyd? How had her identity been changed? What did she know about him? What did Michael know? And most importantly, what had Floyd done with the boy? The answers required going deeper into Floyd's history. His past was not clean. It was not simple. It was not the history of an ordinary father caught in a custody dispute. There were convictions. There were escapes. There were aliases. There were relationships with people whose lives had been disrupted by his presence. The pattern was difficult to dismiss. Floyd had repeatedly shown an ability to move beyond the reach of authorities. He could disappear. He could reinvent himself. He could convince people to accept a new identity. And he could use the confusion created by those identities as protection. The question became whether Michael had been the ultimate victim of that pattern. By the time investigators obtained Floyd's confession, they had enough history to understand the stakes. The interview was not simply a conversation with an old prisoner. It was an attempt to reconstruct a disappearance that had lasted decades. Every word mattered. Every location mattered. Every detail had to be examined. Floyd claimed that Michael had been killed. He described the shooting. He described what happened afterward. He gave investigators a location. That information was immediately important, but it also created a problem. Floyd had lied before. How could investigators know whether he was finally telling the truth? The only way was to test his words against the physical world. So they searched. The landscape became the witness. Investigators examined the area where Floyd said he had left Michael. The search was methodical. Specialists participated. The objective was simple. Find something. Anything. A fragment of clothing. A bone. A bullet. A trace. A piece of evidence capable of turning a confession into a physical conclusion. But the search produced no recovery. The silence of the land was devastating. For the investigators, it meant the story remained incomplete. For Michael's family, it meant the boy was still not home. And for the case itself, it created an unresolved tension between what Floyd had said and what investigators could demonstrate. This is where the story becomes especially difficult. There is a temptation to believe that a confession automatically ends a mystery. It does not. A confession can be powerful. It can reveal facts that only the perpetrator should know. But when physical evidence is absent, every detail must be examined carefully. Was the location accurate? Was the memory accurate? Was the confession complete? Was there a motive for deception? Was Floyd attempting to gain something from investigators? Or was he finally telling the truth after decades of silence? Those questions have no easy answers. And because Floyd eventually died, the possibility of resolving them through another interview disappeared. He could not be taken back to the location. He could not be confronted with new forensic discoveries. He could not be asked why the search failed. He could not explain whether he had deliberately left something out. The final opportunity to obtain information vanished with him. But there is something else investigators learn from the case. Identity itself can become evidence. The name Tanya Hughes had once seemed complete. It was not. The name Clarence Hughes had seemed complete. It was not. And the name Franklin Floyd had itself been concealed beneath another identity. The case demonstrated how a criminal can hide not by destroying every record, but by scattering the records across different identities. One document tells one story. Another tells a different story. A photograph belongs to one name. A birth certificate belongs to another. A family remembers a third. The truth exists somewhere between them. Investigators had to bring those pieces together. That process eventually restored Suzanne's identity. But it could not restore Michael. And that difference remains heartbreaking. A mother was found. A child was not. A name was recovered. A body was not. A suspect confessed. The evidence remained incomplete. The case moved closer to the truth without ever reaching the kind of ending families dream about. There is no final scene. No definitiva veria. No moment when investigators could tell the family, "We found him." Instead, there's a photograph, a 6-year-old face, and a question that has survived decades. If Michael was killed as Floyd claimed, where are his remains? If the location was wrong, why? If the confession was incomplete, what was omitted? If someone else knows something, will they ever speak? These are not questions that can be answered by speculation. They require evidence. That is why the case remains so powerful. It does not need a sensational theory. The documented facts are disturbing enough. A young woman died under a false identity. Her alleged husband was living under a false name. Her child was not biologically related to the man claiming to be his father. That man later abducted the child from school. The child disappeared. Decades later, the mother's identity was restored. The man confessed to killing the boy. Investigators searched. The boy was not found. The suspect died. And the mystery remained. That sequence is enough to explain why the case continues to haunt investigators and families alike. Because every major question eventually received an answer, except the one that mattered most. Where is Michael? The years have made that question harder, not easier. The landscape has changed. The witnesses have aged. The suspect is dead. The evidence has deteriorated. But the responsibility to remember has not disappeared. Michael was not a headline. He was not merely a case number. He was a child who went to school. He had a face. He had a voice. He had a mother. He had a life before the disappearance. And there should have been a life after it. That is what makes the unanswered ending so painful. The case contains enough truth to reveal the darkness, but not enough evidence to illuminate the final destination. And so Michael's story remains suspended, not forgotten, not resolved, not completely understood, suspended, waiting for the possibility that something still exists somewhere in the world that can change the final chapter. A forgotten record, a newly discovered witness, a forensic breakthrough, a piece of land that has never been properly searched, or simply someone who remembers something they once dismissed as unimportant. Because after more than 3 decades, that may be what a cold case requires. Not another headline, not another theory, but one small piece of truth that has survived the passage of time. Until then, the photograph remains. The boy remains 6. The name remains Michael Hughes. And the question remains exactly where it was when the first investigators realized that the child was gone. Where did Franklin Floyd take him? What happened after the vehicle disappeared from view? And where, after all these years, is the final evidence that could bring Michael home? The answers may still exist, or they may have vanished with the man who knew them. But as long as the case remains unresolved, the silence itself becomes part of the evidence. A silence lasting decades. A silence surrounding a child. A silence that began the moment Michael disappeared through the school doors and followed the case all the way into the final years of Franklin Floyd's life. And even after Floyd was gone, that silence remained. Because the man had died. The mystery had not. The mystery became even more disturbing when investigators realized that the disappearance of Michael Hughes could not be separated from the history of the people surrounding him. The boy had not simply vanished from an ordinary family. He had vanished from a world in which names could change overnight, addresses could become meaningless, and the person standing beside you might not be who official records said he was. For investigators, that meant the usual questions had to be asked differently. Where did Michael go? Who was responsible? Who had access to him? But beneath those questions was another one that had to be answered first. Who exactly was Michael Hughes? The name appeared in school records. It appeared in custody documents. It appeared in the missing person investigation. It appeared in the photographs circulated after his disappearance. But name is not always an identity. In this case, investigators had already learned that lesson the hard way. Tanya Hughes had not been Tanya. Clarence Hughes had not been Clarence. And the man behind that false identity was Franklin Floyd. Once investigators understood that, every document connected to Michael became more significant. A piece of paper that once seemed routine could contain a clue, A date could establish where someone had been. A signature could connect one identity to another. A photograph could reveal a relationship that official records had obscured. The investigation became a reconstruction of a life. Not a single crime scene. A life. And the further investigators went backward, the more disturbing the picture became. Suzanne Marie Savakis had been a child when Floyd became involved in her life. Years later, she was living as Tanya Hughes. By then, the original identity had been buried beneath another name and another history. Then she had a son, Michael. For the boy, the false identities were simply reality. He did not have perspective of an investigator. He did not know which names were legal. He did not know which stories were true. He only knew the people around him. He knew his mother. He knew the man he believed was his father. He knew the places where they lived. He went to school. He had routines. He was a child. That ordinary childhood makes the later disappearance so difficult to comprehend. The morning Michael was taken did not look like the beginning of a decades-long mystery. It looked like a school day. Children entered the building. Teachers prepared for class. The principal carried out his responsibilities. Parents trusted the institution. Then Franklin Floyd arrived. The atmosphere changed instantly. A gun transformed an ordinary school into a hostage scene. The principal was forced to comply, and Michael was taken. There was no time for a family discussion. No opportunity for Michael to say goodbye. No chance for authorities to establish where Floyd intended to go. The boy disappeared into a vehicle, and the trail began. For investigators, the first hours were critical. A vehicle can be located. A suspect can be tracked. A witness may remember something. A child may be spotted. The longer the search continues, however, the more opportunities disappear. Roads connect places. They also create escape routes. A person can travel hundreds of miles in a single day. A child can be moved from one state to another before authorities understand the direction of travel. And Floyd knew how to move. He had spent years living outside the identity authorities believed belonged to him. That gave him an advantage. Every investigator searching for Franklin Floyd was also searching through a history of names. But the authorities eventually found him. They found the man. They did not find Michael. That distinction became the dividing line between an arrest and a resolution. Floyd could be prosecuted. Michael could not be returned. The investigation, therefore, continued without the one witness who could have provided the most direct account: the child himself. Michael could have told investigators what happened after he left the school. He could have described where Floyd drove. He could have remembered a building, a road, a person, a conversation. Even a 6-year-old can provide information that becomes invaluable when investigators know how to interpret it. But Michael never came back to provide it. His silence was not voluntary. It was imposed upon the investigation by his disappearance. That is why the case remained alive even after Floyd was imprisoned. A conviction did not tell investigators what a child was. A prison sentence did not create a grave, and the passage of time did not answer question. Years passed. The world changed. The technology available to investigators changed. The case remained. Eventually, the investigation began to benefit from forensic methods that had not been available when Michael disappeared. DNA could establish relationships with extraordinary precision. Old records could be digitized. Information from different jurisdictions could be compared more easily. Historical photographs could be examined. Investigators could revisit questions that had once been impossible to answer. And the most important breakthrough concerned the woman who had died years earlier. Tanya Hughes was identified as Suzanne Marie Savakis. That discovery fundamentally altered the understanding of Floyd's history. The young woman whose death had originally been investigated as a tragic incident was now connected to a childhood identity that had disappeared long before the Oklahoma case. Her family could finally understand what had happened to her. But the discovery also made Michael's disappearance more painful, because Michael was not simply a missing child connected to a mysterious woman. He was Suzanne's son. Her child had disappeared after her death, and the man connected to both identities was the same man, Floyd. The case now formed a chain. Suzanne, Tanya, Michael, Clarence, Franklin. Each name represented a different part of the story. The challenge was determining how they connected. That reconstruction became essential. If investigators could establish the timeline of Suzanne's life, they could establish when she was with Floyd. If they could establish when she became Tanya, they could understand how the false identity was created. If they could establish Michael's relationship to her, they could understand the custody situation. If they could establish Floyd's movements, they could narrow the search for Michael. Every answer could potentially lead to the next. But the case was already decades old. The timeline contained gaps. People remembered different things. Documents had disappeared. Some witnesses could no longer be located. Some were no longer alive. The world in which the crimes had occurred had changed. Even the physical locations had changed. That is one of the greatest obstacles in historical investigations. The past leaves evidence behind, but the evidence does not remain untouched. Buildings are demolished. Land is developed. Roads are widened. Businesses close. Records are destroyed. Memories become uncertain. A witness who once knew exactly what happened may remember only fragments decades later. And fragments are difficult to prosecute. Investigators therefore had to distinguish between what could be proven and what could merely be suspected. That distinction is essential in a case surrounded by sensational details. There were theories. There were rumors. There were claims. But the investigation had to return repeatedly to evidence. What could be verified? What could be independently confirmed? What could be connected to physical evidence? What could be established through records? And what depended entirely on Floyd's own statements? Those questions became especially important after Floyd confessed. His confession was a major development. He told investigators that Michael had been killed. He described how. He provided a location. The case suddenly had a possible explanation. For the first time, investigators were not simply searching blindly. They had a direction, a place to examine, a story to test. The search became the physical examination of Floyd's words. If his account was correct, the ground might contain the answer. If his account was incomplete, the search might reveal nothing. Investigators went to the area. They searched. They brought specialized knowledge to a problem created more than 2 decades earlier. But the ground remained silent. No remains were recovered. No definitive physical evidence was found that could provide the ending everyone wanted. That result did not erase Floyd's confession, but it created uncertainty around its final details. The location might have been wrong. The landscape might have changed. Evidence might have disappeared. Or Floyd might have withheld information. The investigators could not simply choose one explanation because it was emotionally satisfying. They had to live with uncertainty. And that uncertainty became part of Michael's legacy. For the family, it meant that even after the confession, they could not say they knew where Michael was. They could say what Floyd claimed. They could say what investigators believed. They could say what the evidence suggested. But they could not point to a location and say, "This is Michael." That is an enormous difference. The human mind wants endings. A missing child should be found. A murderer should be identified. A victim should have a grave. A family should have somewhere to mourn. But real investigations do not always provide those things. Sometimes the truth stops short. Sometimes evidence disappears. Sometimes a suspect dies. Sometimes the final answer remains just beyond reach. The Michael Hughes case became one of those stories. And as the years continued, the question changed from whether Floyd had been responsible for the disappearance to whether investigators could ever recover the physical truth of what happened. Floyd's criminal history made the problem more complicated. He had already demonstrated that he could manipulate identities. He had already escaped authorities. He had already lived under false names. He understood the value of confusion. That meant investigators could never forget the possibility that even his final confession might contain manipulation. But there was another possibility. Perhaps the confession was the closest thing to the truth they would ever receive. Perhaps Floyd had finally decided to reveal what happened. Perhaps he knew that his life was nearing its end and that the story would eventually emerge with or without him. If so, why provide a location that could not be confirmed? Was his memory incomplete? Was the land different? Had he misunderstood where he was? Or was the location intentionally misleading? There is no simple answer. And because Floyd died, the opportunity to ask him was lost. His death closed a door that had remained open for decades. No investigator could ever sit across from him again. No one could place a map in front of him and ask him to identify another location. No one could challenge him with a new forensic discovery. No one could ask him whether he had lied about the boy's final moments. The suspect was gone. The child was still missing. The mystery had survived both. That is why the case cannot be reduced to a simple confession. The confession is part of the story. It is not the entire story. The entire story includes a mother whose identity had been stolen. It includes a child who grew up surrounded by false names. It includes a school kidnapping. It includes a fugitive. It includes a decades-long investigation. It includes modern forensic science. It includes a confession. And it includes a search that ended without the recovery of the victim. Every part matters. Remove one piece, and the meaning changes. Remove Suzanne's identity, and Michael's story loses its context. Remove Floyd's aliases, and investigators lose the explanation for how the family remained hidden. Remove the kidnapping, and there is no disappearance. Remove the confession, and Michael's fate becomes even more uncertain. Remove the failed search, and there is no physical contradiction between confession and the absence of remains. Together, those pieces create the disturbing shape of the case. And still, the center is empty. Michael, the boy who should have become a man. The boy whose future exists only as a possibility. For decades, investigators and relatives could look at his photograph and imagine what he might look like now. Older. Different. Perhaps gray-haired one day. Perhaps with children of his own. Perhaps living under another name. Or perhaps never reaching adulthood. The photograph cannot answer that. It only preserves the last confirmed version of him. A 6-year-old child. That image is more than evidence. It is a reminder of time. Because every year that passed after his disappearance was another year that Michael could not be photographed. Another birthday that could not be confirmed. Another school year that did not exist. Another holiday without him. Another family memory that remained incomplete. The world continued. Michael's family had to continue too. But continuing is not the same as forgetting. The absence remains. It appears at birthdays, at family gatherings, in old photographs, in conversations about the past. A missing child does not simply disappear from a family's emotional life. The child becomes a permanent question, and the question can last longer than the people who first asked it. That is why remembering Michael matters even decades later. Because cold cases are not only investigations. They are unfinished human stories. And sometimes the most important evidence is the refusal to let the victim become only a statistic. Michael Hughes was 6 years old. His disappearance was real. His mother was real. The deception surrounding them was real. The man at the center of the case was real. And the unanswered questions are real. No amount of time changes that. The case may become older. The records may become harder to interpret. The witnesses may become fewer. But the fundamental question remains unchanged. Where is Michael Hughes? And perhaps that question is the one detail Franklin Floyd could never completely erase. He could change names. He could change stories. He could disappear. He could manipulate records. He could remain silent. But he could not erase the fact that a child had vanished. He could not erase the photograph. He could not erase the investigation. He could not erase Suzanne's identity forever. And he could not make the unanswered question disappear. Because somewhere inside the decades of records and false identities, there remains a simple truth. A child went to school. A man came for him. The child never came home. And no matter how many years pass, that is the point where the story refuses to end.